Good day, everyone. I'm Patricia Andy Lopez, one of the plenary speakers for today. So again, welcome to our webinar. The topic that is assigned to me is assessment tools for selecting relevant and appropriate non-digital resources. But before that, let me present first our objectives for this topic. At the end of this webinar, the student should be able to first is to identify the assessment tools and non-digital resources to be used in classroom. Second is to determine the selected assessment tools relevant and appropriate for non-digital resources that is suitable for the learner's head. Next is to use the things to consider in making an assessment and the guidelines in evaluating non-digital resources. Lastly is to adopt the selected assessment tools for the relevant and appropriate for evaluating non-digital resources. In this discussion, we are going to discuss about selecting assessment tools for relevant and appropriate non-digital resources. And here's the outline of what I am going to discuss to you. Is what is the assessment? Second is what are the common non-digital resources that can be evaluated. And third is the things that we need to consider in making an assessment for non-digital resources. And fourth is the guidelines in evaluating non-digital resources. And lastly is the kinds of assessment tools. So first, let's discuss what is assessment. Assessment is the action or an instance of making a judgment about something, or the evaluation or estimation of the nature, quality, or ability of someone or something, or also can be a resources. Assessment is to measure effectiveness by evaluation, adds a value component to the process. A teacher, or as a future teacher rather, you may assess the resources that you wanted to use in ascertain how well that resources can successfully meet your learning target. There are two types of assessment resources, where it is digital and non-digital resources, but today we will focus on non-digital resources. So, what are the common non-digital resources that can be evaluated? We all know that the non-digital resources is not relating to or using computers, internet, or other digital technology. There are 5 common kinds of non-digital resources, where it can be textbook, magazine, newspaper, notebook or a personal note, and lastly is the catalog. Since we are done defining what is assessment and the 5 common used non-digital resources, let's now identify the things that we must consider to assess non-digital resources. Here are the things that we must to consider to assess non-digital resources. First is making a judgment. As a teacher, or a future teacher rather, it is the important role that we must to do in selecting relevant and appropriate non-digital resources that you will use. Why? Because making good judgment, well-informed, wise decision can produce the desired outcomes. Is evaluating. Evaluating the non-digital resources is an important part of the learning context that you wanted to give to your students. In evaluating, you can identify if the resources is reliable or true, nor will all information be suitable for the learner's head. Lastly is estimating. Estimating these resources assists you to categorize the type, quantity, and characteristics of resources that are required to complete the learning context, which allow more accurate cost and duration estimates. Making a judgment, evaluating, and estimating can assess the nature, quality, and ability of a non-digital resources that you will use. Next is the guidelines in evaluating non-digital resources. The guidelines in evaluating non-digital resources, first is the date of publication. Date of publication is when the book or article published, or are able you to use older information, or does it need to be as current as possible? Or information in the sciences is updated frequently and research on scientific topics demands up-to-date information. Next is the publisher. Do you recognize the name of the publisher? Probably not. There are thousands of publishers and it is impossible to know the reputation of them all. Next is the type of publication. Type of publication. If you are doing your learning context in periodical literature, it is critical to determine if the article you are looking at is from a scholarly, popular, or a trade of publication. Next is the intended audience. Intended audience is who did the author write the work for, or the other specialists in the field, or the general population. Knowing the intended audience of a book or an article can help you to determine if it is appropriateness for your learning context. Objectivity or bias. Objectivity or bias, it is sometimes quite difficult to distinguish solid resources. When the reading materials, ask yourself if it is assumptions the author makes are reasonable and grounded in fact and resources, not in emotion. The content. The content. Does the material cover the topic as you thought it would? Or if it is covered to your topic only marginally? Or is it updating what has been established in the field? Or have you read similar facts and interpretation in other resources? Remember, you will need to consult a number of resources to get a well-balanced understanding of your topic. You may also need to determine whether a non-digital resources is primary or secondary. And lastly is the reviews. Reviews is evaluating that can assist you in critiquing library materials. Evaluating reviews of books and articles are almost always written by other experts in a field or discipline. Since we are discussing the guidelines, now we are discussing what are the kinds of assessment tools. Assessment tools are: first is rubrics, second is checklist, and third is the rating scale. What is rubrics? Rubrics is an evaluation tool, or can help you to determine if the resources is a good resources or one that is reliable to use to the learning context. It can also help you to weed out bad resources. Rubrics is to assess the resources that you will use and also to have an informative feedback and a detailed evaluation for your desired outcomes. Two types of rubrics, which are analytic and holistic. Analytic rubrics. Analytic rubrics describe weak on each criterion separately. It is utilizes separate holistic ratings of specific characteristics, products, or behavior. This is the example of analytic rubrics evaluating a newspaper. As you notice in the picture, the first column is called as scale and scoring, while in the left horizontal column, it is the characteristic that seek to be measured, or also known as criteria or components, and this is the performance descriptor. Analytic rubrics provide non-digital resources clear definition of evaluation criteria. It is either may or may not points to each criteria. Holistic rubric. Holistic rubrics describe the work by applying all the criteria at the same time and enabling an overall judgment about the quality of the work. It is utilized as holistic rating for a product or behavior. Rubrics for evaluating a journal. If you notice in the photo, holistic rubrics do not separately contents for each criterion. Instead, it is assigned contents by assessing it across in a multiple criteria as a whole. Next is checklist. Checklist asks for dichotomous decisions, typically has or doesn't have yes or no for each criterion. It is the assessment tools that set specific criteria which the educators may use this gauge for evaluating non-digital resources. A checklist is a standardized list of required steps developed usually for repetitive tasks. It provides several benefits. Of checklist evaluating a textbook. It helps the educator to be more organized, assuring them that they will not skip any important step in the process. Checklist helps us to move quickly, be more efficient, and save time. Rating scale is a closed-end survey question that is used to evaluate how the survey responders feels about a particular product or the digital resources. And it is also asked for decision across the scale that does not describe the content. Allows to indicate the degree if the resources that you will use can be effective for the strategies that you will use for the learners. Rating scales also give you an information for setting goals and improving the learning context that you wanted to create. In rating scales, the descriptive word is more important than related number. Of rating scale, evaluating a catalog. As you notice, it states the criteria and provide 3 or 4 responses selection. So now, here is the example video of evaluating one of the common non-digital resources using the analytical rubrics.
Since we are done discussing
kinds of assessment tools, so now, here is the example video of evaluating one of the common non-digital resources using the analytical rubrics.
and also checklists. In selecting relevant and appropriate assessment tools for non-digital resources. So, this is the developed assessment tools that we will use for today, or also called as analytical rubrics, where the first column or the scale and scoring is containing exceptional, good, and fair. While in the left column is the characteristic or the criteria where it has the essential parts, content, information, pictures and mechanics, and lastly is the design. And in the middle part is the things or the standard of how the magazine will be evaluated. If the essential parts and contents of magazines are present, extra is added, or a newspaper exceeds expectation, then it is exceptional. But if the magazine is complete, all parts are present, then it is good. And also, if magazine is substantially complete, a few parts are missing, it is only fair. Next is the information. If the magazine is exceptional information, provides the true concept of its purpose, and has an educational purpose, then it is exceptional. But if the magazine only develop information, provide good description of the purpose, then it is good. And a very basic and little detail, it is fair. In pictures and mechanics, if the magazine has a variety of pictures are present, or absolutely no spelling or grammar errors, then it is exceptional. But if the magazine has all pictures and captions are clear, and one spelling or grammar error, then it is good. And if the magazine has a few pictures are present, 2 spellings or grammar errors did not always credit websites for pictures, then it is fair. So now, let's take a look of some parts of S&T Post magazine. Since we are done citing some parts of the magazine, Let's now evaluate it using the assessment tools or the analytical rubrics that we mentioned earlier. So, let's start. Is the essential parts or contents of the S&T Post magazine is exceptional, good, or fair? As for me, it is exceptional. Why? Because as you can see, the all parts of magazines are present and exceed the expectations. Next is information. Is it exceptional, good, or fair? Well, as for me again, it is exceptional. Why? Because these magazines tackle how DOST initiatives have created an impact in agriculture, enterprise, industry, IT/BPM, health, education, and also in disaster preparedness. And also, the information provides a true concept of its purpose and has an educational purpose. Next is the pictures and mechanics. Is it exceptional, good, or fair? As for me, it is exceptional because as you notice the pictures and mechanics of S&T Post magazine, it has a variety of pictures and absolutely no grammar error. And lastly is the design appearance. Is it exceptional, good, or fair? As for me again, it is exceptional. Why? Because as you can see, S&T Post magazine has a complete design and show creativity, and also it is organized. S&T Post magazine has a higher score in our evaluating using the criteria that we use. S&T Post magazine is beneficial both for the students and educator. S&T Post is one of the non-digital resources that the teachers can use to enhance their learning context. Thank you! So now, we will evaluate the S&T Post magazine using the checklist. This checklist contains the guidelines in evaluating non-digital resources. This is the label, or in other words, your question. Questions that we will use to evaluate the magazines. It contains the author credentials, publishers, objectivity or bias, content, and lastly is the review. This is the choices, or also known as the items. So let's start. The first question is, can you determine the author's credential, such as education background, current position, and so on? The answer is yes. Why? Because it is found in the beginning of the journal article. Next is, are you able to use older information or does it need to be as current as possible? The answer is also yes. Why? Because it is beneficial even if it is published 2 years ago. Next is, does it provide a background information? The answer is yes. And this is the background information of the magazine. Next is the review of the magazine is good? The answer is yes. Why? Because S&T Post magazine is containing the beneficial information which can be a good non-digital resources that can help the teachers. And lastly, do you recognize the name of the publisher? And the answer is yes. Why? Because the S&T Post publisher is the Department of Science and Technology, or also known as DOST. And that's all. Thank you. Before using non-digital resources to a learning context, you must evaluate it first, using a selected assessment tools for relevant and appropriate non-digital resources. Also, to know if it is beneficial both to the teachers and the students to enhance teaching and learning. I hope you have learned in what we discussed about selecting assessment tools for relevant and appropriate non-digital resources. And that's all.
Thank you!